Other news tonight, Donald Trump was formally certified as the winner of the presidential election today, but not before a handful of Democratic members of Congress tried to object. Their efforts were quickly squashed by Vice President Joe Biden.
Mr. President, I object to the certificate from the state of Georgia on the grounds that the electoral votes were not...
There's no debate. Sections 15 and 17 of Title III of the United States Code require that any objection be presented in writing, signed by both a member of the House of Representatives and a senator. Is the objection in writing and not only signed by the member but by a United States senator?
Mr. President, even as people waited hours in Georgia...
There is no debate, and if there's not signed by a senator, the objection cannot be entertained.
Mr. President, the objection is signed by a member of the House, but not yet by a member of the Senate.
Well, it is over.
Mr. President, I object to the votes from the state of Wisconsin, which should not be legally certified or regulated.
Does the gentlelady, does she? Please come to order. The chair has previously ruled. Suspend.
Donald Trump received 304 electoral votes and Hillary Clinton received 227. 7 faithless electors voted for other candidates, costing Trump 2 votes and Clinton 4, but were the results of the election influenced by Russian cyber hacking. The U.S. intelligence community believes so, and today they presented their case directly to the president-elect. And with more now on today's intelligence briefing with Mr. Trump, our KCAL 9 political reporter, Dave Bryan. Dave.
Susie, the briefing went for nearly 2 hours and was described as constructive. But the Trump briefing wasn't the only major event on intelligence and the Russian hacking accusations. A report on the Russian cyber attacks aimed at the American presidential election, a report ordered by President Obama, was delivered to him and to President-elect Trump today, and a smaller declassified version was made public. The 25-page report doesn't mince words, stating directly that Russian President Vladimir Putin ordered a covert cyber campaign in 2016 aimed at Hillary Clinton, against whom Putin had a grudge. He blamed her for inciting mass protests in Russia against his government in 2011. Clinton was Secretary of State at the time. Putin's payback attack was multifaceted misinformation warfare that included Twitter propaganda and fake news, and the hacks of state and local election boards and the Democratic National Committee. The report says we also assessed Putin and the Russian government aspired to help President-elect Trump's election chances when possible by discrediting Secretary Clinton and publicly contrasting her unfavorably to him. The classified version detailed intercepts of Russian officials congratulating each other on the Trump victory, and it identified the Russian actors who gave stolen data from Democratic officials to WikiLeaks for release. CBS News reports investigators noted WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange, who received and distributed the stolen material in dribs and drabs, met with an executive from RT in 2013. That's a Russian network that airs in the U.S. And Assange has reportedly collaborated with RT several times since. When Trump won the Republican nomination, intelligence officials believe Putin clearly favored him over Hillary Clinton and undertook the clandestine campaign to increase his chances of winning. House Intelligence Committee member Adam Schiff from Burbank read the classified version of the report.
The daily dumping of documents that were damaging to Secretary Clinton, the dumping of which was made possible by this Russian cyber operation, had an effect on the outcome of the election. Whether it was decisive or not.
While all that was happening, President-elect Donald Trump met for 2 hours with the leaders of America's intelligence agencies in a briefing he said was constructive. After the meeting, Trump released a statement saying Russia, China, outside groups, and people are continuously trying to mount cyber attacks against the U.S. He did not say, however, if he agrees with the conclusion of the intelligence agencies that Russian President Putin directed the attack. But in recent days, Trump's surrogates have been framing the issue as sour grapes from Democrats.
There are those out there who are trying to delegitimize his presidency, review the election results, and you know it.
In his statement, Trump went even further. There was absolutely no effect on the outcome of the election, he wrote, including the fact that there was no tampering whatsoever with voting machines. Since the election, Trump has been questioning the validity of the intelligence findings.
They have no idea if it's Russia or China or somebody. It could be somebody sitting in a bed someplace.
He needs to acknowledge that the Russians did this. It wasn't China. It wasn't some 400-pound guy, and that he's willing to work with Congress to fight back.
Vice President-elect Mike Pence attended the Trump briefing with the intelligence agency leaders.
The President-elect has made it very clear that we're going to take aggressive action in the early days of our new administration to combat cyber attacks and protect the security of the American people from this type of intrusion.
And tonight, Mr. Trump is back on Twitter. An hour ago, he tweeted, "Gross negligence by the Democratic National Committee allowed hacking to take place. The Republican National Committee had strong defense." And in his statement after that briefing, President-elect Trump said he'll appoint a team to give him a plan within the first 90 days for fighting the cyber attacks. Susie, a lot of moving parts.
Yeah, and a lot has transpired just in the past 2 days, Dave. I mean, we had the Senate committee hearing,
right.
Then we had a new report released, and then a president-elect briefing from intelligence officials.
Yeah.
What happens now?
Well, clearly it's not over yet. Okay, we can say that for sure. What happens next is the Senate Intelligence Committee. That's a different committee, will hold a hearing on the Russian cyber attacks. It's scheduled for next Tuesday, and many of the same intelligence officials who testified at yesterday's hearing will be back for the sequel. And it appears the Democrats and some Republicans will continue to push the president-elect to acknowledge that the Russians are to blame for this. His tweet tonight notwithstanding, even as Trump continues to insist that the cyber attacks had no impact on the election. The Dems charge that's not the point. They say the Russians meddled in our election. Trump charges they're trying to discredit his victory. So, Susie, still a lot to go on this.
Yeah, okay.